there's not going to be peace in Europe while Putin is in the Kremlin.
Mm.
Ukraine is going to be in a state of war with Russia, even if the guns have fallen silent because the Russians have been defeated. And Ukraine has got to be part of NATO because that is the one security guarantee that ensures that this war does not start all over again.
And US intelligence suggests that Russia has suffered 100,000 casualties in the last 5 months in the war in Ukraine. That includes more than 20,000 deaths. Well, yesterday, Russia launched a series of missile attacks against Ukrainian warehouses filled with ammunition. It seems to be an effort to slow Kyiv's preparations for a counteroffensive that analysts have been expecting is due to start in the coming weeks. Richard Shirreff is the former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in Europe, and he's just returned from Kyiv. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
What do you, obviously without giving too much of the game away, what do you know about how any spring offensive may have been affected by these missile attacks?
The answer is I don't know if it's been affected or not. What I can tell you is that they reckon they're in pretty good shape, that they are short of ammunition and fighter aircraft. Those are the two major requirements. So if these attacks have had a hit on ammunition dumps, that could have an impact.
And what have they said about morale at this point? I mean, it's been, hundreds of days since this invasion. And, there was a point where we were talking about this every day, and we are not now talking about it every day. And that must worry them, of course. But what about their morale in all of this? Has it faltered at all from the people that you were speaking to?
No. I mean, I think you get an extraordinary impression of dynamism, determination, unity of purpose, extraordinary sort of agility and intellectual vigor, and an absolute determination that they recognize that any sort of negotiated ceasefire is just going to mean the war goes on, the massacres go on, the rapes go on, the deportation of children go on. So they are determined to see it through to victory. However, there's no question they're tired. The fighting, particularly in places like Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Volodar in the east, has been extraordinarily bitter and tough. And of course, that carries a price, not only in the numbers of casualties, but also psychologically too. Be under no illusions. The Ukrainians are going to go on fighting whatever happens, and we just need to be there to provide whatever we can to support them.
The commander of ground forces there has said that Ukrainian counterattacks have ousted Russian forces from some positions in Bakhmut, which you mentioned. You mentioned Bakhmut there. What do we know about the situation, for example, in Bakhmut?
It was described to me by a senior minister. He said, "We have designed a very effective meat grinder in Bakhmut." In other words, what the Ukrainians have done quite successfully, is grind down the Russian offensive, cause massive Russian casualties by sucking them into an attritional fight. Now, the Ukrainians have lost a lot of manpower as well there, nothing like on the scale of the Russians. And as far as the immediate gains are concerned, well, this is a really nasty urban battle, and there will be gains and losses. As I said, the Russians are fighting for every house, every pavement, every street, and in order to try and exhaust the Ukrainians. But equally, the Russians, as I said, have suffered massive casualties, and of course that impacts on Russian manpower elsewhere.
You said earlier, and I don't doubt it, having spoken to many Ukrainians over the last, over at least a year, that they say that they will continue. Obviously, they'll never give up. They'll just keep going. If you had to put a timescale on this, what would you say, or is this indefinite?
It all depends on us, and of course on the Ukrainians' ability to fight. I think we should manage expectations about what is a forthcoming spring, early summer offensive. It will happen, but it's not going to be one bound and we're all free. I think we're talking about a series of counteroffensive or offensives over a period of time, and each offensive is going to need a lot of time to prepare for, to build up the troops, to build up the resources, the logistics, the equipment, to train. And so I think we should be thinking in terms of 2 to 3 years, a campaign of 2 to 3 years. And at the same time, between each offensive, the Ukrainians are going to have to defend against continued attacks. But gradually, over a period of time, I'm sure the Ukrainians will evict the Russians from Ukraine territory, or at least as much of Ukraine territory as will give them long-term security. And then we're into a different game altogether long-term, because there's not going to be peace in Europe while Putin is in the Kremlin. Ukraine is going to be in a state of war with Russia, even if the guns have fallen silent, because the Russians have been defeated. And Ukraine has got to be part of NATO, because that is the one security guarantee that ensures that this war does not start all over again.
You said that it depends on us. When you say us, who do you mean, and what do we have to do?
We've got to recognize that this is a war against us. This is a war that's been fought physically in Ukraine, but it's been fought against us in energy, politics, information terms. And it's a war about Ukraine being a part of the West, which it is. And so therefore, we've got to be prepared to fight that war as best we can by supporting Ukraine. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to intervene. That is the last thing we should be thinking about. It may happen. It may come to that, to avoid a long war of attrition. But what it means right now is giving Ukraine what it needs. As one Ukrainian politician minister said, we are sick and tired of dying while Western politicians dither. And that is what is happening. They need fighter aircraft, they need ammunition, and they need all the other paraphernalia of war. And it's got there, but it's got there slowly, and there's been no, and then eventually the answer's been yes. And meanwhile, Ukrainians die and the war goes on.
So you believe we have dithered?
Yes, no question about it. If our politicians had been bold on the 25th of February 2022 last year, and ramped up immediately with all the paraphernalia the Ukrainians need, we wouldn't be in a position where we are now. Arguably, of course, this war started in 2014, and if we'd given the Ukrainians the capabilities they needed then, this war would never have started.
So why didn't we? Just finally, because you said that, until we see an attack on Ukraine as an attack on all of us, why do you think, it might have changed now, but why do you think in February last year that perception did not exist?
You better ask Western political leaders. These are political decisions.
Richard Shirreff, thank you for talking to us. He is the former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in Europe.
And we all remember on this programme, the day of the invasion of Ukraine, he came on at 8 o'clock and talked about it then in terms of, I think we'll never forget, and this notion that it could be 2 or 3 years. And he wouldn't rule out their Western intervention if necessary, that this is a war with the West, and therefore that means that the West could eventually have to get on the ground as well. So this notion that this spring offensive will take us clear doesn't seem to be necessarily going to pay off.